Thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. And if you want to support Future Hindsight, the indie pro-democracy podcast that we are, join the Civics Club on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/futurehindsight now. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. In this very reactionary time in American history, it's undeniable that we need to go back to the drawing board. So we thought an obvious place would be to look at Marx and Marxism with 21st century eyes. Our guest is Andrew Hartman. He's professor of history at Illinois State University. He's the author of several books, including A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars, the co-editor of American Labyrinth, Intellectual History for Complicated Times, and his upcoming book is Karl Marx in America. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Mila.
So most of us probably have a misconception of who Karl Marx is and what his ideas were. So I think we need to start with the basic definitions. We know, of course, that Karl Marx is a German philosopher who was a prolific writer and famously wrote Capital, and together with Engels, wrote the Communist Manifesto. And I note here that this episode is coming out the day before the 177th anniversary of the Communist Manifesto's publication. But to return to the question, how would you describe Marx and Marxism?
That's the ultimate question, isn't it? So I've written a book about how Karl Marx's ideas have, I guess, played out throughout American history. And so Marx himself is a very important figure there as a person, but more importantly, sort of as somebody who created a body of work, a body of ideas that have persisted up until this day in people's minds as being relevant. Marxism has a long and torturous history that is both complex and oftentimes changes depending on the time and context. But for my purposes, to be a Marxist simply means that you have a particular way of understanding capitalism. That is, that the most important feature of capitalism is the relationship between those who own things, like what Marx called the means of production, but this would be like the factories or the land or the media, and then everyone else, for the most part, who has to work for them, or as Marx would have put it, has to sell their labor in order to survive. So famously, using the language of the Communist Manifesto, this is the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And Marx, in his time, when capitalism of this sort was relatively new and had not gone global, theorized that that aspect of our human relations, that is, there would be two classes of people, those who owned and those who worked for those who owned. He theorized that eventually everybody would come to be a member of one of those two classes, or almost everybody. And I think that is, to a large extent, become true, and that is one of the reasons why Marxism has continued to be relevant to lots of people, even after the failure and fall of most of the states that organized around Marxism, most particularly the Soviet Union. And I think that's why people are still reading and talking about Karl Marx. In fact, there's been like a recent influx of people reading Marx and talking about Marx again, perhaps more so than we've seen since the 1960s or even the 1930s. So to me, that Marxism is just a particular way of understanding capitalism. And then also, most Marxists want to do something about it, but that's where Marxists tend to disagree.
Right. There are many shades of Marxists out there. And I have had the great pleasure of pre-reading your book before it's being published officially in May. It's really a beautifully written, very comprehensive history of Marxists in America. And I didn't know there were quite so many socialists and communists that I want to say have not captured the American popular imagination over time, although we'll get a little bit to that later. I have a question about that. But let's talk about what Marx's criticism was of capitalism's effect on society and humans. He thought, of course, that eventually capitalism was going to self-destruct in some way and that the proletariat would rise. And he lived through many economic booms and busts like all of us have here in the United States in his own lifetime. And he was often, in fact, optimistic that these boom and bust cycles would eventually bring about the end of capitalism. But what exactly is his critique of capitalism?
Sure. Great question. So for Marx, he was one of the most deeply read people of the 19th century. And this is at a time in which, if you were lucky enough to be somebody who might be considered a philosopher or an intellectual or a thinker, you would have been widely read in a whole host of different, what we would now call disciplines, from history to sociology to literature. And he was deeply read in all of these, especially in history. And when he looked at history in the grand scope, he came to believe that throughout history, the main feature that defined how people lived was through class relations, through those who owned or those who controlled and those who kind of served at the pleasure of those who owned and controlled. He thought that capitalism was consistent with this, but that it had become more opaque or more cryptic, more difficult to understand because, unlike feudalism or unlike slavery, there wasn't a very sort of explicit master or an explicit owner. But he also thought that at the same time, capitalism had made human relations in the grand scale more exploitative perhaps than ever. He believed that humans naturally worked on their environment. That's how we survived from the time in which Homo sapiens came into existence. He called this our species being or our essence. Like that was a natural thing. We worked the land to survive. We made things to improve our lives. And you could call this technology or whatever, but this was natural to human existence. What capitalism had done more than any system prior is had separated us from this species being, from our natural essence, so that most people were working long, long hours, but rather than reap the fruits of that labor, which was natural in Marx's eyes, somebody else was reaping the fruits of it. And in fact, the whole system of labor exploitation was predicated on the fact that people had to work long, long hours in order to survive for the profit of somebody else. And that this was, like, for him, an incredibly exploitative situation that almost made people less than human in his eyes, because he had a very clear sense of what was natural for humans, and humans couldn't thrive, couldn't be happy unless they were living in these natural ways. It's a very 19th century way of thinking. We don't tend to, at least academics or those on the left, don't tend to talk about nature or what's natural to humans, human nature, quite in the same way anymore. But he firmly believed that capitalism had just wrecked the human capacity for happiness, wrecked the human capacity to flourish, and that most people were alienated from themselves, from each other, from society. The early Marx in particular really spoke a lot about alienation, and that's an aspect of Marx that has continued to resonate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think in this time, I think a lot of people would argue we're deeply alienated from ourselves and from each other, of course, because of technology, Zoom, for example, and of course, the way that we live through this time. Actually, it's really interesting that you talk about Marx talking about being connected to nature. And I think in the context of capitalism being destructive, we have a lot of evidence all around us about this very thing. I think Exhibit A is the climate crisis. I think our separation somehow from nature, and I feel like this willful denial that extracting so much from the earth is not going to actually affect us directly. And nothing could be further from the truth, of course. And also, of course, the alienation that I just mentioned in terms of our relations to each other. We live in a world of deep inequality all across the globe where it's possible on one side that people live on less than $2 a day. And at the same time, there are people who are worth hundreds of billions of dollars, which seems, when you think about it, it seems like it doesn't make sense that we're all inhabiting the same planet. And if Marx were alive today, I wonder what kind of essay would he pen about the billionaire class and the gig economy?
The title of it would probably be I Told You So. Yeah. So Marx was fallible. He was human. He made mistakes as a person, to me, is less interesting than the fact that he made mistakes as a thinker. But his basic conception of capitalism and what it did to humans, and also to some extent what it did to climate or the environment, was essentially true. And that's why people continue to read Marx. For example, Howard Zinn, the left-wing historian who was most famous for writing a people's history of the United States that continues to be read all across the world, and that conservatives continue to lament that fact. He wrote a play in the 1990s called Marx in Soho, and that's exactly what Howard Zinn tried to imagine is if Marx were alive at that point in the 1990s, what would he think? And essentially Marx's theories in this play by Howard Zinn had panned out to a remarkable degree in terms of thinking about the globalization of capital accumulation that had wrecked so many lives and had sort of spread misery across the planet while some people got rich beyond their wildest dreams. One of Marx's basic theories of capitalism is that it's at one level very wonderful in the terms of the things it can do in terms of technological development. It creates the capacity for humans to live without having to labor as much as humans in the past have had to because of the sort of technological advancements, but also even more so the advancements in terms of organizing ourselves into large units like what we would call corporations. So I think he would look around and say, look at all this wonderful stuff, but hardly anybody can share in the wonders. And also because of how unequal things are, because a few men control most of the wealth in the world, most people are more alienated than ever. I think he would say, yeah, this is what I expected, but I don't think he would have expected it would have taken so long for humans to get their act together to sort of create something new. And of course, that's one of the things that critics across the 20th and 21st century of Marx and Marxism have pointed to, what next? Marx predicted that capitalism would fall, that capitalists were creating their own gravediggers, and yet here we are. Perhaps things are worse than ever in terms of inequality, in terms of exploitation, in terms of our destruction of the very thing we need to survive, that is the planet and all of its resources.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we're just beginning here with the Trump 2.0 administration, and I think that the end of capitalism is maybe finally here, maybe near, maybe this is the beginning of the end, I don't know, or maybe there's yet another turbocharged version that has yet to appear, which sounds, improbable. But at the same time, it's the kind of thing where I think Marx would have also thought where we are today is improbable, that, capitalism continues unabated in a way, despite a lot of agitation for better conditions for workers. Because at the same time, the exploitation of workers, of course, continues. Think about people who live in and work in sweatshops, let's say in Bangladesh. That hasn't disappeared. That's probably almost the same as it was during Marx's time when he was writing. But, talking about exploitation, he actually made an explicit connection between freedom and labor, which I was not aware of until I read your book. And we think of Marx in the abstract, without situating him in history. So I was a little surprised to read that he was alive during the time of the Paris Commune, during the time of the American Civil War, and that he wrote Lincoln a letter congratulating him for winning. And in fact, he followed that war really closely because he believed that eradicating slavery was necessary for labor everywhere. So in a way, I'm thinking about the fact that we still have exploited labor in these sweatshops in other parts of this world, not in the United States, although I think there's some of that here to a certain extent, Amazon warehouses, let's call it. He made an explicit connection that I had not considered, and I think most people don't know about. Tell us more about how he thought about freedom and labor.
Sure, yeah, that's to me one of the most important questions about Marx and one of the driving reasons why I wrote the book. And in fact, there's a whole flourishing recent literature on Marx and his ideas that focuses in particular on his conception of freedom. And I think one of the reasons why this is returning, this is like an older feature of the Marx literature that goes back to the 19th century. But because of the Soviet Union and communism throughout the 20th century, official state communism, there was less of a focus on that. But I think since the fall of the Soviet Union, and in particular in the last 10 or 20 years, people are much more interested in sort of freedom aspect of Marx's theory. So if you think about it in these terms, in capitalism, most people don't have a lot of free time because so much of our time is spent working. And while we're at work, most people, like, you could never describe the conditions of work. You kind of laid it out nicely when you're talking about sweatshops in Bangladesh or sweatshops in Amazon warehouses right here in the United States. Most people, while they're at work, they don't experience freedom. Like, there's nothing freeing or liberating about that experience. And they have to spend so many hours of their life under those conditions in which a boss, a manager, or the system in some sense has almost totalitarian control over them, over their bodies. And yes, you could always say, well, they could just quit. That's not always true everywhere, but maybe in the US, yes, if you work at Amazon, you could just quit, but you have to pay the rent, you have to feed your kids. Like, that's part of Marx's whole theory and premise of capitalism, is that most of us have to sell our labor in order to survive, and that's not a condition that creates freedom for most people. And he studied the United States very closely, especially for somebody who never visited the United States. He was able to, in part because he was such a voracious reader of American newspapers. And then, of course, throughout the 1850s, he was a regular correspondent for the New York Tribune, which was the most widely read newspaper in the world during the 1850s, about 200,000 subscriptions.
That's remarkable. I mean, I thought when I read that, I was like, oh, wow. And that, one of the things you mentioned in the book is that there are some readers who said that, that Karl Marx is such a sharp thinker. And I thought, wow, who knew? I didn't know that 200,000 people on a regular basis read Karl Marx in the newspaper.
Yeah, so most of the articles in the New York Tribune were without bylines, kind of like a 19th century version
like
of The
Economist. Yeah, exactly.
Although there was a 19th century Economist as well. So they didn't necessarily know who they were reading. Some people did. But yeah, so it's highly likely that, for example, Abraham Lincoln, who was an avid reader of the New York Tribune, had been following European politics through the lens of Karl Marx's writings, right? He wrote over 500 articles for the New York Tribune. So he paid attention to happenings in the U.S., but also, he was an avid participant in the 1848 revolutions in Europe, in particular in his home, Prussia. And when those revolutions failed, particularly throughout the German states, people who were on the side of the revolutionaries had to flee. Many ended up in the United States, and these were Marx's friends. And he kept up correspondence with many of them. And so, he had this deep connection to what was happening in the U.S., and he paid very close attention to the politics of slavery and secession. And then during the Civil War, the New York Tribune let him go because they lost a lot of money and couldn't afford to pay him because of the war. But then he started writing articles for an Austrian newspaper about the U.S. Civil War. And he wrote a lot of letters, exchanged letters with Engels and other of his comrades in the U.S. There's great collections of all of his Civil War writings, and you can really see a sort of like thinker coming alive to a situation that's helping him formulate larger ideas about the world. And so the first volume of Capital, which he had been working on since the early 1850s, is finally published in 1867, 2 years after the end of the U.S. Civil War. And especially the sort of very remarkable chapter on the working day, a lot of it is shaped by his attention to slavery in the Civil War. There are lots of allusions to the Civil War and to slavery in North America in Capital. And what he believed, And what slavery helped him understand is kind of going back to this conception of labor in relation to freedom. And so he thought of labor as like on a spectrum from free to slave or free to unfree. And yes, the chattel slavery in the United States was like the worst form of labor for humans. It was the least free form of labor. But what the Republican Party at the time called free labor was not free. It was on a spectrum. It was somewhere in between, because most people, by virtue of having to sell their labor, didn't have full autonomy, didn't have full control over their lives, over their bodies. And I think really thinking about slavery and its effects on not just the enslaved, but also on politics and the larger sort of understanding of labor really shaped his thinking about not just freedom, but also the political situation for the working class. And this is when he came to firmly believe, and stated it many, many times, that the working class would never be free, that capitalism would never transition into socialism if there was slavery, because that divided the working class in a way that just made such solidarity between them impossible. And so although he mostly spent his life writing about capitalism and the sort of politics of capitalism, and didn't spend too much time thinking about a future socialism, even though that's often what he's most famous for, he definitely thought that if socialism was going to be achieved, if post-capitalism was going to be more liberating than capitalism, it was going to require people who worked for a living to come together to create something new. And so, like, to go back to one of your early questions about what he might think about now, there are people all over the world still struggling in these ways, but I think that the working class in the US, but also elsewhere, is kind of disorganized, and that reactionaries have been able to take advantage of that situation to full effect. And that's like one of the problems we're faced with, is that a sort of social politics of the working class has not been very successful lately.
Yeah, that's really an interesting thing. I ask myself this all the time. Like you said, Marx had this idea that after capitalism falls, we would have socialism, and yet there isn't really a movement for it. And what I'm really curious about and don't fully understand is, how did Marx actually think about getting there? I mean, there have been so many financial crises, as I mentioned earlier, and he thought that maybe this one is going to, or this strike would help finally bring socialism to life. We've had so many events that could have precipitated a full-blown socialist revolution, let's call it, but that hasn't happened. And I wonder, what does that tell us about Marx's theory of change?
Yeah, good question. And that, of course, is a question that takes up a lot of space in my book, especially in the middle of the 20th century, when you had American liberals and American conservatives, and many on the left, or former leftists, who were posing that exact question, like, okay, so what now? Because this doesn't seem to be working, right? Or we don't seem to be moving anywhere good. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of like two layers to how Marx thought about the shift from capitalism to socialism or communism. These were terms that were often used interchangeably in the 19th century for Marx. So like, if you think about capitalism growing into ever larger institutions and entities, factories, workers would be thrown together in ways that they would come to recognize the similarities of their shared conditions, and that would help them organize against their system of oppression. This is what Marx described in the Communist Manifesto as capitalists digging their own graves. And so he truly believed that the way in which capitalism was developing in terms of like the socialization of production, in other words, like things coming together on the producer side, would lead to the socialization of human relations once the humans involved, especially the workers, recognize their conditions. At various points, this happened to a small degree, and I think you could say like the labor movement over the course of the last 2 centuries is a product of this kind of understanding of capitalism and what happens to workers in it. The other side of Marx's theory is he thought a lot about the sort of inevitable crises of capitalism. And so just in his life, he saw several extremely damaging economic crises of capitalism, 1830s, 1850s, and then he didn't live long enough to see, of course, the 1890s, which was one of the worst. He saw one in the 1870s, but then there was another even worse one in the 1890s, each getting worse and worse. And then there's the 1930s, and many Marxist historians would say that the two world wars of the 20th century were the inevitable sort of byproduct of these crises of capitalism. That's a debate for another time. So he thought that if workers were organized, if they had that sort of solidarity, they could take advantage of these crises. And as each crisis got worse and worse, the working class would be well positioned to transition to have a revolution, a socialist revolution. Obviously, it hasn't happened, or at least not yet, but it's really hard to anticipate that happening right now as we sit in 2025. And so that aspect of Marx and Marxism, I don't think is as relevant as perhaps it once was. Although I do think that when the working class through the labor movement organizes, that's one of the most important things that people can do to make their lives and the lives of others better. It's the most important sort of counterforce to oligarchy. But the reason why I think Marx is still relevant goes back to his theory of labor exploitation and freedom, like how he thought about capitalism and conceptualized the way it made us unfree, the way it alienated us, is still so highly relevant. Maybe it's up to us to imagine how to create something different.
We'll be right back with Andrew Hartman, so stick around. You'll love this episode's Civic Spark, I promise. It's one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, if you've ever run a business, you probably know very well that you cannot do it alone. So when you think about the most successful businesses, the ones you see everywhere, the ones with sales through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, you surely think about a great product and a cool brand with brilliant marketing, but you just can't overlook the businesses behind the business, the secret ingredient that makes selling, and for shoppers buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business behind them is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. You want to know why? Well, for starters, Shopify is home to the #1 checkout on the planet. And we can't forget about the not-so-secret Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way fewer carts going abandoned and way more sales going cha-ching. So, if you're into growing your business, then your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Is that so much to ask? Of course not. And that's why businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. If you have a business, you want that business to grow. It's a no-brainer. But no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. And that's what I love about Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/hopeful to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/hopeful. And now, let's return to my conversation with Andrew Hartman. Well, it's interesting you talk about organizing labor. Of course, that's one of the big things that he talks about a lot, and that's really where you start. Being a Marxist is organizing labor. But here in the US, I think labor organizing is not very strong, and I think we really think here about solving our problems through democracy, through, electoral politics. But in the last 25 years, I have to say I've been increasingly thinking that democracy is maybe just an illusion. And let's say the presidential election last year in 2024 was kind of the nail in the coffin. But I am a hopeful person, and we are a pro-democracy podcast, so I'm not quite giving up yet. But I have been wondering for a while, are capitalism and democracy compatible or incompatible? And I have to say that I've asked this question several times on the podcast, and none of the guests so far have yet to give me a straight answer on whether capitalism and democracy really should hang together. Or maybe not.
Well, I'm so happy that I can break that string. I don't think they're compatible at all. I think they're completely incompatible. But again, I would think of democracy on a spectrum in much the same way like Marx would think of freedom in relation to labor on a spectrum. This is a very Marxist take on democracy, I think, as well. There have been moments in American history, and the United States is historically probably the most capitalistic nation in world history. And also, we like to think one of the sort of like originators of political democracy, although that's a more contested history. But at every step, democracy, if we define it as rule by the people, and by the people we mean everybody, at every step it's been highly constrained. Now that's true of democracy almost everywhere throughout history, but in particular, in the US, it's been highly constrained in large part because of capitalism, and I think that's more true now than ever. And so if we only think of democracy as electing people to lead us or represent us every 2 to 4 years or whatever it is, I guess capitalism and democracy can work fine, although even by that very limited definition of democracy, I think things aren't going so well. We have to sort of expand our imagination when it comes to democracy. We have to think about being free to rule ourselves in all aspects of our lives. And there are so many aspects of our lives where we're not free to rule ourselves. And when you really think about it, the thing standing in the way of that freedom in so many aspects is capitalism or one of its byproducts. If you have $1 billion, you have so much more power, not only over the political system, but over your own life. I mean, you are an autonomous individual. Mm-hmm. But like as a college professor, I have a lot of autonomy over my life, but I still, in many ways, am constrained. You know, I make $90,000 a year, which is a lot more than a lot of people, and I don't complain about that, although I think I'm worth more.
100%.
Yeah.
100% you are worth more, for the record.
But it's not a matter of jealousy. It's a matter of, by virtue of the fact that I don't make more money, there are ways in which I'm constrained, indebted, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm one of the privileged when it comes to thinking about academics because, and this is like a narrow slice of life, but just think about the billions of people across the planet who are completely constrained by the fact that they just don't have enough wealth, money, resources to actually have autonomy over their life, to actually rule themselves, govern themselves. Mm-hmm. And thus they are controlled by other people. In the US, we, I guess, get to choose the people who control us, but we have a very narrow set of parameters around which we choose the people who control us. And it seems to get narrower every 4 years.
Yes, recently on a podcast, I had a scholar on who wrote a book about why political parties are not responsive to their constituents and why they're not behaving like proper political parties anymore. And they used to be, let's say, in the days of Tammany Hall, where the party was definitely responding to you and vice versa. But it was a different kind of system, right? But all this to say, she said, people are now voting but not choosing. And I thought that was a really great analogy. It's like we're voting, but we're not choosing because, you know, in a world where we have, in the words of Maurice Mitchell, who is the national director of the Working Families Party, he said, you know, in a world where we have 300 flavors of yogurt, we shouldn't have only 2 candidates for president. You know, it just doesn't make any sense. The world is so different today. We should be thinking about our representative politics differently.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. Or at the very least, under the way in which parties are organized in the US around 2 parties. One of the 2 parties should represent what I old-fashionedly call the working class.
Yes.
And neither does. And so the Republican Party is, at this stage, for those of us who care about democracy and freedom, completely hopeless. But the Democratic Party has like occasional flares of hope.
Occasional. I mean, they just elected as DNC chairman somebody who said we have good billionaires. So I was rather flummoxed when I saw this press conference because I thought, no, you know, this is no different. I'm sorry. This is, as Ralph Nader said, it's like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Like, this is not a viable politics for anybody except for Elon Musk.
Coke or Pepsi, right? Yeah, better billionaires. I feel like the Democratic Party, and this is a long-standing problem going back at least to the 1980s. I mean, we can talk about a deeper history, but going back to the 1980s, the Democratic Party has completely shifted its priorities, is no longer at the national level interested in, for example, its relationship with labor unions, except as just subservient voters. Mm-hmm. And instead is interested in impressing, well, the billionaires or a professional class of technocrats. And also, and this came to the surface in both of Bernie Sanders' attempts to win the Democratic nomination, more interested in protecting its power, the elite's power over the party, than in winning elections.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, we agree. So as a Marxist, as a self-described Marxist, what's in your mind the intersection of democracy and Marxism? If you could pinpoint one place where we're like, this is the place we need to go after.
So I hate to beat a dead horse, but it's at the workplace. We need to invest more energy in creating better working conditions for people. And the only viable way to do that historically is through stronger and better labor unions.
Well, tell us what is a better and stronger labor union? Because I already mentioned labor unions are not very strong in the United States. They never really have been. Even in its heyday, they were not that strong. I mean, capitalists hold all the power. I had a conversation just yesterday about, somebody said to me, oh, all these small theaters, the workers there here in New York want to unionize. And I said, well, they should, because otherwise they have no power to bargain for better wages, and wages are too low. And then she goes, yeah, but then they're all going to close. And I just thought, there's this cycle. And I feel like everybody is always saying the same thing back without actually thinking that if you make even $15 an hour, you're making $30,000 a year. And nobody can live on $30,000 a year in the United States. It doesn't matter where you live, So I feel like even though the idea of belonging to a union is currently gaining popularity, there's so much pushback from the regime and from corporations, capitalists. How can workers actually unite? What's it going to take? And realistically, in this year, 2025, or let's say in the next 2 or 3 years, to be optimistic, what would be a positive evolution for labor unions?
Really good and really tough question. Because with the second Trump regime, it's going to be, at a legal level, more difficult to organize labor unions than it has been in a long time. But it's not like we're in uncharted territory. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the federal government, the state government, local police forces were all arrayed against labor unions. And yet, by the time you get to the 1930s, which is in some of the direst economic times in American history, the greatest crisis of capitalism, perhaps, labor unions grew to be stronger than ever. And I think that's a model, like obviously, there are a lot of things that are different now, but one thing I would think you and I could agree upon is that most people are really struggling to make ends meet and working shitty jobs doing so. That was certainly true in the 1930s, and yet predicated on decades of labor organizing, the unions all across the U.S. got very militant, got very organized, and basically created what, in retrospect, we consider the middle class of the 50s and 60s, when there was a real strong, what we call the middle class. That's kind of a, I think, problematic term, but lots and lots of Americans in the U.S. had prosperity as a result of the 1930s labor movement. And what changed is they started organizing everybody. They quit worrying so much about their particular workforce, like it being necessarily electricians or whatever. They started organizing everybody along industrial lines. They started working together and coordinating together across the nation. So you had, for example, in 1934, strikes across the nation, including textile worker strikes from Maine all the way down to Florida. They started recognizing that the more people involved in this, the more power they were going to be, and they had to quit sort of like fighting over divisions. And so under the umbrella of the Congress of Industrial Organizations during the 1930s, they started organizing people whom unions had largely ignored prior, like sharecroppers, like Mexican immigrants working the fields in California. The list goes on, people who unions previously had ignored. And I think there are sort of like signs that this is happening, but a labor movement that's only thinking about its membership in very narrow terms is a very weak labor movement. But if you start thinking about a labor movement, including everybody who works for a living, that can be a very powerful thing. I mean, we're nowhere near that, but there are signs. The attempts to organize Starbucks, the attempts to organize Amazon, the attempts to fight for a living wage in various cities over the past 10 to 15 years, especially in like the fast food industry, attempts by grad students to organize. The list goes on. There's a lot of really good things happening in the labor movement. And in fact, as a result of this, more Americans than ever have a favorable view of unions now than they have since the 1960s. So there's some really good developments, but they're just sort of like at the start, and you could see things going either way, really poorly, or maybe things will start to grow in a good way. Mm-hmm. But in relation to our political system, to me, the only time that the US had anything approaching a democracy that was responsive to most people would have been during the period of the New Deal, at least in terms of like the Democratic Party being in control of things mostly and being responsive to most people's needs when it comes to things like basic Social Security and protection at the workplace.
Yeah. Well, I would say that conservatives, since the New Deal until today, are animated in dismantling the New Deal. Like when people talk about dismantling Social Security, that's about New Deal politics, right? I think a lot of people don't know that history. But, we do live in a unique political system. It's non-parliamentary. We have the Electoral College, which is patently unfair. We have a powerful activist Supreme Court. We have legalized corruption by way of lobbying, minority rule, all of these things. And we agree, I think, both of us, that we are in a chaotic and, as I mentioned in the intro, a reactionary timeline. And we talked about labor unions already and what promise they might hold if we can become potentially more militant or at least have more solidarity among workers all across industry. What kind of wisdom, aside from labor union solidarity, can Marxism offer right now?
So when Marx, in the 1850s, this is a time period in Europe that was incredibly reactionary, in some ways very similar to our own times now, across the planet, but especially in the US. Marx was pretty depressed. His own life was not going well. He was living in exile in London. He was very poor. Several of his children died of diseases that poor people died of in the 1850s, like tuberculosis. And yet he continued to read and think and talk to people and write about ways to change the world. And to me, that's like the most important thing most of us can do, is just continue to have hope for a future, because the future will surprise us. It certainly surprised Marx when, for example, you had enslaved people rising up in arms against the system under the leadership of John Brown. Like, he celebrated John Brown's uprising at Harper's Ferry, and the developments like that were both surprising and encouraging to him. I think we have to have hope even in these dark times, and we have to just continue to not only organize, whether it's in unions or otherwise, but we have to continue to just be human, to read, to think, to talk to one another. And even though there are lots of humans around us who are doing really bad things that make us really depressed, to not lose our hope in the capacity for humans to also make things better. So one of the reasons I wrote my book is I want more people to not only think about Karl Marx differently, but think about the possibilities of what somebody who reads and writes and spends their whole life thinking about the world, what kind of change they can make, what kind of change we can make.
Yeah, well said. So I feel like I need to ask you this question because you mentioned earlier that socialism and communism was used interchangeably during Marx's time, but I think we understand that differently today. And I feel like we should ask this question because now we are post-Soviet Union and in a very different kind of communism, let's say in China, in a way that I think we would not have expected in 1989, right? So what is socialism and what is communism? What's the difference?
I still, at a philosophical level, think of them as interchangeable, but I tend to use the word socialism to describe myself and a politics I want because it is less tainted by the 20th century. It's really hard to convince people, especially in the US, that communism is the way we should go, given the Cold War, given how bad the Soviet Union and other communist states were in many ways. And also, given the intense anti-communist propaganda that has defined so much of American history, not only since the early Cold War, but really going back to, like, for example, the Paris Commune. So I tend to use the word socialism because we tend to associate communism with like a state control, state command of everything in really totalitarian or oppressive ways. And socialism doesn't have quite the same sort of negative connotations. So let's just stick with socialism because that's what I'm sort of laying claim to. It is a much more sort of democratic way of living because we have socialized not just production. We already have socialized production. The world is more connected in terms of the making and distributing of goods we need than it ever has been. Not to mention more connected than it ever has been in terms of communication. And yet we haven't socialized human relations. A few people benefit tremendously from the current system. Another maybe 5 to 10% benefit quite a bit. And then there's like 90% of the human population that is not benefiting whatsoever from the current conditions. And I think what we need is to like socialize the human side of capitalism, and that to me is socialism. It would mean a lot more freedom for a lot more people. Life would still be difficult. This is not utopian in the sense that we're going to wipe away all our problems, but I think we would be dealing more with just sort of like the ordinary problems of life and rather the extraordinary problems of life that we seem to be dealing with so much as of late.
So forgive me for asking, what is an ordinary problem and what's an extraordinary problem?
An ordinary problem. Your kids won't listen to you.
I see. And you won't be worrying about going to war over oil.
Yeah. Or death. We're all still going to die.
Yes, we're all still going to die 100% of the time. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us today into action?
So I won't go the union route since I've already talked that to death. But given that we're in a really sort of like difficult time in terms of it's very difficult to know what to do right now.
Yes, I agree. It's very hard. We're all looking.
Yeah, we all feel paralyzed. And so, a lot of us will look locally, sort of tend to our own gardens, which is great, but I guess that's not really going to change the conditions either. One thing that I advise people to do is find ways to connect with other people that will change their and other people's sort of understanding or political consciousness. Form a reading group and everyone read something that is very challenging, either at an intellectual or a political level. I just think
I like that a lot. That's so awesome.
Yeah. So like one of the things that's really interesting in my book is I've learned throughout U.S. history, since Marx became a thing in the U.S., people have formed reading groups and they read Marx together. And we're not just talking about sort of grad students, as you might imagine. We're talking about like working class people really struggling through difficult texts to try to understand their world. I feel like we need more of that. Mm-hmm. And to me, that could be a really sort of radical act in today's world of social media and our diminishing attention spans. Spend some time with something difficult, like reading a philosophical text like Capital, or it doesn't have to be Marx. There's so many other great things. And do it with other people. Talk about it.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I have been saying that we need to, in this time, slow down and become more philosophical because we need to really think deeply about what we want next instead of just, I don't know, answer the text and go to a protest, which is also good, of course, but really do some deep thinking, which I think cannot happen without reading difficult books.
Yeah.
You're not going to do the deep thinking all on your own, First of all, without community and without books, that's not going to be possible.
Because in reactionary times, I mean, you're exactly right. In reactionary times, when we have reactionaries leading us, if you want to call it that,
yes,
they want us to react constantly. Like Trump and his administration are trolling us every day. And
yes.
that's where he gains his power, is trolling us so that we react, so that our anger feeds him and his base. And I'm not saying we should just disengage. That's not the answer. We should pay close attention to what's going on and resist it or fight it when we can. But I think you're exactly right. We need to slow down and think about what's next in a much grander scale. We don't need like a bunch of MSNBC zombies who are just, that's not the solution.
Yeah, it really isn't. Well, here's my last question. You reminded us that Marx was hopeful, even though he was depressed about the way things were in his lifetime. And he suffered a lot as a consequence of his poverty in his last years living in London. Actually, reading his history really gave me courage to stay hopeful. But for you, looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
Well, studying history does. Historians tend to be jaded because a lot of bad stuff has happened in history and because it seems like nothing is new, although history doesn't repeat itself. But history also gives me hope, and there were so many people in dark times who struggled to make life better for other people. That's a very hopeful thing. And then also I'll do the teacher or professor answer, but my students really do give me hope. Like, my students are also jaded in the sense that they don't have faith in our political institutions. They don't have faith in our leaders of either party. And yet they're very curious about why they feel that way and what they can do to make things better. That gives me hope. I mean, they should be deeply skeptical of our institutions. That's a healthy attitude. And they don't necessarily always have the answers to it. I guess in part that's what we're for, and also why the Trump administration is going after academic institutions right now, because there is a lot of potential in young people if they read the right books, if they come to a different understanding of the world. I don't want to use the word right, but start thinking about the world in much different historical, philosophical ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is hopeful. It is hopeful that young people are skeptical, actually. I think a lot of people say that young people have anxiety about the state of the world. And whenever I hear that, I say, right, because that makes sense, right? To have anxiety about the state of the world. And I just kind of feel like when people dismiss that, sort of like, oh, young people, they're lazy and they're anxious. Why? It's like, well, why do you think? This is a very difficult time to be alive. And, I have young adults as children, and it's the kind of thing where they are deeply curious about how this is all going to play out in the long term. And I think it's good to be curious, because otherwise, if you're checking out, it's really a problem. And I think young people are not checked out, even though they may appear that way because they're attached to their telephones. But they are deeply curious, and I think that's a good sign.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Mila. This was really fun conversation.
Thank you. Andrew Hartman is professor of history at Illinois State University and the author of Karl Marx in America. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Start or join a reading group and read political philosophy. We promise it's more fun than it sounds, especially when you have friends around you. It doesn't have to start with Marx, of course, but find what speaks to you and dig in. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Faz Shakir. He's the executive director of More Perfect Union. He formerly ran the Bernie 2020 campaign, served as the ACLU's national political director, and also served as senior advisor to the late Senator Harry Reid. That's next week on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app. We know you want to stay engaged, and we're here to help. Follow Future Hindsight now so our brand new episodes will pop into your rotation every week. And maybe you need an extra push, so sign up for the newsletter at futurehindsight.com. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,